You must see this. What is it? The arrangement is final. No, it cannot be.
You composed nothing, Lady Harwick said. She did not raise her voice. Women of her position never needed to. She turned the pages of the pianoforte score with two gloved fingers, the way one handles something unclean, and she looked at Philippa Crane across the width of the morning room, as though Philippa were a stain that had proved resistant to removal. These melodies were transcribed by my late brother from folk sources. Your name on the dedication is an embarrassment to the paper it was printed on. Philippa did not look away. She pressed the pad of her right thumb very slowly against the corner of the mahogany music stand until she felt the edge of it bite, not enough to mark the skin, just enough to feel something solid and real. And she held the small pane there like an anchor, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and she did not allow her face to do anything at all that Lady Harwick had not already decided it would do. The morning room smelled of cold ash and freesia. 8 women of the county sat arranged around Lady Harwick's charity committee table. Their teacups had been arrested halfway to their mouths. Their eyes were doing that particular English thing of looking very hard at absolutely nothing. The Andante Favori Society purchased 50 copies, Lady Harwick continued. 50 copies, Miss Crane, bearing your dedication, my brother's dedication. I shall be writing to the publisher this afternoon to have the entire run withdrawn, and I shall be writing to the magistrate's office the morning after. Philippa released the music stand. She smoothed her glove at the wrist, one slow pull of kid leather over her knuckles. Then she said, and her voice came out exactly as she intended it, level and almost musical, the voice of a woman who had learned long ago that politeness had never once protected her and so had stopped hiding behind it. Lady Harwick, your brother did not compose those pieces. I did. I can prove it, and I will. The teacups went down. She had been selling her compositions under the name P.H. Crane for 3 years now. The H stood for nothing Helena, technically her middle name, but she had chosen it because it gave the initial a blunt, masculine quality that made publishers read further before they stopped reading. The publisher in Henrietta Street, a decent enough man named Mr. Marsh, had agreed not to inquire too closely because the work sold, and because in 1814 a score bearing a woman's full given name moved approximately, as well as a pamphlet on the correct management of field drainage. She had not expected success. She had expected moderate sales and modest anonymity and the private satisfaction of hearing her music played by people who did not know she existed. She had not expected the Andante Favori Society to dedicate their entire spring concert to P.H. Crane. She had certainly not expected Lady Harwick's younger brother Rollo, 31, charming in the way of people who have never needed to develop any other quality to write to Mr. Marsh, claiming that he was P.H. Crane, that the H stood for his middle name, and that he could produce original manuscript annotations in his own hand to prove it. He could produce them because he had stolen them. In January of 1811, when Philippa had been employed for 6 weeks as music instructress at Harwick Park, she had left her working folio in the music room overnight. She had been too tired to carry it up 3 flights of stairs. She had told herself she would collect it in the morning. In the morning, it was gone. Rollo Harwick had told her, with a sympathetic tilt of his head, that she must have misplaced it. She had searched the music room twice. She had asked the housekeeper. She had asked the footman. She had asked Rollo Harwick again, and he had looked at her with a smile she recognized now, 3 years later, for exactly what it had always been, the smile of a man who is certain that no one will take your word over his. And he had said, gently, "My dear Miss Crane, I think you may be overwrought." Lady Harwick had dismissed her the following week. The stated reason was impertinence. The impertinence had consisted of asking one final time where her folio was. She heard about the Duke of Norburn the way one hears about approaching weather vaguely, inaccurately, and slightly too late to prepare. He had taken Aldwych Hall for the shooting season, the village said, though no one had seen him shoot anything. He was reclusive. He was cold. He had, some years ago, been involved in a court proceeding so dreadful that even his own solicitors had stopped repeating the details, which meant the details were either very interesting or very expensive to suppress. He did not attend assemblies. He did not call on neighbors. He walked on the fells alone at hours when respectable people were indoors, and Mrs. Patchen at the apothecary claimed to have seen him in the churchyard at dusk, though what he had been doing there she could not say, only that he had been very still. Philippa's employer, Mrs. Tavish, a brisk, sensible widow whose late husband had left her a small but efficient wool business, a house with good bones and drafty windows, and 3 daughters who needed educating in the pianoforte, relayed all of this at breakfast on a Thursday in October, while the rain came in hard off the fells and the fire in the grate breathed out the smell of damp peat. "He is looking for a wife," Mrs. Tavish said. She said it with the same tone she used to announce that the dairyman had raised his prices factual, slightly aggrieved, ready to act. Through correspondence, a family friend is managing the arrangement. The Duke apparently will not attend any social gatherings whatsoever. "Then he is hiding from something," Philippa said, cutting her toast. "Or someone," said Mrs. Tavish, and looked at Philippa over her spectacles in a way that suggested she was already doing arithmetic and had arrived at a number she found interesting. She met him 9 days before she knew who he was. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the lending library on Kettermore's single respectable street, a narrow, wood-paneled room above a printer's shop that smelled of old leather and the particular damp that comes from books that have been rained on and dried and rained on again over many decades. The rain outside was steady and gray. The small coal fire in the corner was doing its inadequate best. He was standing at the geography shelf, holding an atlas open flat with both hands, and he was absolutely, entirely still, not browsing, reading. The complete, closed-off concentration of a man who has learned to be somewhere else entirely whenever the room he is actually in becomes inconvenient. He wore a coat that had been expensive some years ago. His boots were muddy. His hair needed cutting. His face, she registered it only sideways, reaching past him for a volume of Burney's History of Music, was the kind of face that required a second look to fully understand. She did not give it one. "I beg your pardon," she said, reaching past. He stepped aside without looking up. She brought the Burney to the counter and waited for Mr. Prout, the librarian, to finish a heated discussion with a delivery boy about the correct spelling of the word miscellaneous. The man from the geography shelf came to stand beside her. He was still carrying the atlas. "You have the Burney," he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was the observation of a man who notices things and has not yet decided whether to mention them. "I do," Philippa agreed. "I was going to take it. Then you were too slow." She said it pleasantly, the pleasantness of a person who has learned to fence, who knows that a light touch lands harder than a lunge. She glanced at him properly then. He was looking at her with an expression that was not irritation and not amusement, something that had not yet decided which way to go, balanced on a point between them. His eyes were gray. His whole quality was gray, not dull, but overcast. The way the fells looked before the light changed, and you realized they had been extraordinary all along, and you simply hadn't been paying the right kind of attention. She thought, utterly ordinary, the kind of man one would not remember at a dinner, except for the quality of his silence, which was unusual. Most silences were simply the absence of speech. His was something more deliberate. She carried the Bernie home through the rain. She did not think about him again for 4 days. The letter from Mrs. Tavish's family friend arrived on a Saturday and proposed, in neat and sensible terms, a correspondence. A duke, recently settled in the area, wished to begin an exchange of letters with a view to eventual marriage. He was 34. His health was good. His income required no elaboration. He preferred, the letter stated with a directness Philippa found rather refreshing, a woman of genuine accomplishment who was not afraid of plainness in conversation, in scenery, in life. The family friend had thought of Miss Crane. Philippa read the letter twice. She thought about the hearing that was coming. Mr. Marsh had written to her that week, and the word court had appeared twice in a single paragraph. She thought about what it cost her each month to keep her room in Mrs. Tavish's house. She thought about Rollo Harwick's smile, the one that meant, "No one will take your word over mine." She picked up her pen. She wrote that she would be glad to correspond. She did not ask the Duke's name. It had not, in that moment, seemed the most important thing. She had expected ceremony. She had braced for the stiff, managed sentences of a man who has dictated everything to a secretary for so long that directness has become a foreign language. Instead, the first letter was brief and slightly uncertain in a way that felt more honest than any amount of polish. He wrote about the walk he had taken that morning, the frost on the eastern field, a fox he had seen sitting in the pale November light with an expression of complete philosophical indifference to the world. He wrote, "I have been advised that this correspondence ought to be light and agreeable. I find I am not very light. I will attempt to improve." She wrote back, "Please do not improve. Light correspondence is mostly a form of lying, and lying in letters is peculiarly exhausting because you must remember what you said." There was a gap of 3 days. Then, "That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in 6 years. I find I am unexpectedly relieved." "Who taught you to be so direct?" She wrote, "Necessity, and 1 or 2 people who deserved to be called villains and were instead called respectable." Something changed in the correspondence after that. She felt it shift, like a door that has always been slightly ajar, finally opening wide enough to step through. She found herself writing things she had not said aloud to anyone, about the music, about the folio, about the particular quality of humiliation that comes not from being hurt, but from being told the hurt is a symptom of your own disorder. She wrote about standing in Lady Harwick's morning room, pressing her thumb against the wood, holding herself together from the inside, while 8 women watched from behind their teacups. His reply came within a day. It was short. It said, "I know that quality of humiliation precisely. I lived inside it for 3 years while a court decided what had happened to my own life. I want to tell you, the wound is not imaginary. It is never imaginary. They say it is imaginary because the alternative is admitting they can see it, and seeing it would require them to do something about it, and doing something costs more than they are willing to spend." She read that letter 4 times. She put it in the drawer with the others. She sat for a while in the quiet of the evening with Mrs. Tavish's house settling around her, the fire burning down to red, and she thought about a man she had never met, writing truths she had never said to anyone, in letters that arrived smelling faintly of ink and cold moorland air. She thought, too, about the gray-eyed man in the library. She did not know why. Lady Harwick's second move came on a Friday when the frost had turned the glass walls of Mrs. Tavish's small garden glasshouse completely white, every pane laced with crystals so fine the winter light came through in fragments, scattered and cold and beautiful. Philippa was inside giving Eleanor, the eldest daughter, a lesson in counterpoint. The girl had real ability, not the dutiful ability of a child performing for approval, but the restless, curious ability of someone who hears music as a conversation and wants desperately to learn the language well enough to answer back. Philippa had been teaching her for 4 months and had let herself quietly, without quite noticing she was doing it, come to care very much about what this girl might become. Mrs. Tavish brought the letter herself. She stood in the glasshouse doorway with it held in both hands, and her face had the careful stillness of someone carrying a coal that might be live. Philippa read it standing up. The letter stated that Miss Philippa Helena Crane had been found to have fraudulently claimed authorship of works belonging to Mr. Roland Harwick. A formal complaint had been lodged with the publisher and with the magistrate's office. A public hearing had been arranged for the 14th of November. Miss Crane was furthermore requested to return the manuscript annotations currently in her illegal possession, constituting property stolen from Mr. Harwick during her employment at Harwick Park. She did not have the annotations. She had never had them. They had been hers. She folded the letter along its original creases. Eleanor was watching her from the pianoforte bench with the steady, clear attention of a child who understands more than she is given credit for. Philippa set the letter on the windowsill. She looked at the frost on the glass, at the fractured light coming through it, all those broken small pieces of winter sun, and she took one slow breath, and she turned back to her pupil. "Let's try the development section again," she said quietly, from the second bar. She did not see him in the lane. She was looking at the music. But he saw her, the gray-eyed man she had told herself she had forgotten, who had been walking past on his way back from the village, and he stopped because he saw her face through the frost-whitened glass at the moment before she turned away from it. He stood in the lane for a long time after the lesson had resumed. He watched the woman who had just been told, again, that her pain was a crime she had committed against herself, turn back to a child and ask her, gently, to try once more. He had walked a mile back to Aldwych Hall before he understood what he was feeling. It was not pity. It was something closer to recognition. The particular shock of seeing your own experience in another person's body and knowing with the whole of yourself what it costs her to keep her face like that. He sat down at his desk. He wrote her a letter. He wrote it 3 times before he sent it, because the first 2 versions said too much, and he had learned, at considerable expense, what happens when you say too much in writing. The version he sent said only, "I saw you today, though you did not see me. I should like to tell you something, but I find I do not know yet how to say it without sounding either grandiose or maudlin. I will say simply this. I have seen a great deal of courage in my life, most of it on battlefields and in courtrooms. What I saw today was quieter than any of that. It was also braver." She went to Aldwych Hall at 11 o'clock at night. This requires some explanation. 4 days earlier, in a letter that had seemed, on first reading, merely conversational, he had mentioned that Rollo Harwick had paid him a visit that morning and had brought, as a gesture of neighborly sociability, a portfolio of musical scores he was considering publishing. He seemed very eager for my opinion of them, the Duke had written. I could not account for this, as I have no musical judgment of any kind. I have attempted several times to acquire some and have not succeeded. He had then, helpfully, because he was by nature a man who noticed and recorded, copied out the full list of pieces in the portfolio. The fourth piece on the list was titled Nocturne in D, with dedication to Miss E.T. Harwick Park, January 1811. Philippa read that line and sat very still. Miss E.T. She had not thought of that dedication in months. She had written it on the title page of the Nocturne during the last week of her employment at Harwick Park in January of 1811, in the folio that was subsequently taken from her. She had written it because Eleanor Tavish, who had been 11 years old, whose father had died in September, who had cried through her pianoforte lesson 3 weeks running until Philippa had set aside the scales and simply played for her, had asked one afternoon, "Can the sad part get a little less sad?" And Philippa had improvised a variation in the subdominant that was brighter and gentler and slightly more hopeful, and the girl had stopped crying and started listening. And the following evening, Philippa had written the whole nocturne out properly and put Eleanor's initials on it, and the date and the place, because it had been written for her specifically and seemed to belong to her. Rollo Harwick had not known Eleanor Tavish's name in January of 1811. He had not known she existed. He had not been at Harwick Park during those 6 weeks. He could not have written that dedication. No one could have written it except Philippa, because no one else had been in that room with that child on that afternoon. She put on her cloak, took her small lantern, and walked the 2 miles to Aldwych Hall in the dark. The house was mostly quiet. The garden door was unlocked. She knew this because he had mentioned it in passing, the way he mentioned things, as an observation rather than an invitation, though she chose to treat it as both. She went in through a corridor that smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and something faintly mineral, like the smell of a stream in winter. She found the study because there was a thin line of candlelight under the door. She had not expected him to be there. She pushed the door open. He was sitting at his desk with the portfolio open in front of him. A candle burned down to a low stump, and he looked up at exactly the moment she stepped into the room, and for a full breath, neither of them moved. And then she understood all of it. Simultaneously, completely, like a chord resolving after a long suspension, the gray eyes, the lending library, the atlas, the rain, you were too slow, the letters, 6 weeks of letters, the fox in the frost, I am not very light, the man in the lane. She understood everything all at once and felt it move through her like a key turning. The library, she said. Yes, his voice was the same as it was in her imagination of him, reading his letters quiet, measured, a voice that spent its words carefully. You are the Duke. I have been, for some time. She looked at the portfolio on his desk. She looked at him, and then, because it was the true thing, and she had learned to say the true thing, she said, I called you ordinary. Something moved across his face, not amusement, not hurt, the same undecided expression she remembered from the counter with the Bernie, balanced between 2 possibilities. You did, he said. I found it rather arresting, in hindsight. No one had looked at me plainly in years. They all look at the title first, and then they adjust what they see to fit it. You looked at me and saw a man who had lost a race to a book. I also said you had been too slow. You did. I thought about it for 3 days. She crossed the room. She looked down at the portfolio, at the nocturne in D, at the dedication in her own handwriting, the particular curve of her lowercase e, inward and slightly hooked, a habit she had never managed to correct, and something released in her chest that she had not known was held tight. This is mine, she said. I wrote that. I know exactly who those initials belong to and why. I know, he said. She looked up. He was watching her with steady gray eyes, and there was nothing hidden in them, which was unusual. She had grown accustomed to looking at people and finding the thing behind the thing, the calculation beneath the expression. His face was simply open. How do you know? She said. Because I have been corresponding with you for 6 weeks, he said, and I know how your mind moves. I know that when you are building towards something, you make it look incidental first. I know that when you are angry, you become more precise, not less. And I know, he paused, very briefly, that you would not walk 2 miles in the dark to a house belonging to a man you have never officially met unless you were certain. You are always certain before you move. It is one of your finest qualities and also one of your most alarming. She sat down in the chair across from him without being invited to, because they had moved some time ago past the point where invitations were required. The candle guttered. The room smelled of ink and cold and the memory of a fire. He had the annotations reproduced. She said, he must have. He could not have made them himself without the originals. But if he had a printer make facsimiles from the originals before he returned them to the folio. I thought the same, he said. I have been sitting here since 9 o'clock, thinking about a printer in York to whom Rollo Harwick owes a considerable sum of money. She stared at him. You know, a printer in York? I know of him. He has been attempting to collect his debt for 2 years. Harwick has been ignoring the invoices. He looked at her steadily. If the invoice specifies the work, which it may, because printers are exact people, and if the work was the reproduction of manuscript pages, then we have a document in Harwick's hand commissioning the fabrication. The candle was very low. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving against the windows in long, cold sweeps. Philippa looked at this man she had dismissed in a lending library and written to in the dark for 6 weeks, and had never, until 30 minutes ago, known the name of, and she felt something she had not felt in 3 years. The specific, physical sensation of not being alone in a difficulty. Not rescued, she did not want rescuing. She wanted exactly this, another mind, moving alongside hers with equal speed. I called you ordinary, she said, a 3rd time. Not an apology, an acknowledgement of error. He looked at her across the low candlelight and said, very quietly, Philippa, you were the first person in 6 years to look at me as though the title were not the most interesting thing about me. You were wrong about ordinary, but I would rather be wrongly seen by you than correctly seen by anyone else I have ever met. The wind, the candle, the nocturne sitting between them, her handwriting warm on the cold page. We should make a plan, she said, because she was not a woman who let significant moments last so long they became sentimental. Yes, he said, and he almost smiled. And it was, she would think about it later, the most extraordinary face she had ever seen, because it was a smile that had clearly been somewhere dark for a long time and had only just found its way back out. The magistrate's hearing on the 14th of November was a public proceeding which had been Rollo Harwick's idea and proved to be his great miscalculation. He had assumed, as men of his position generally assumed, that the geometry of the room would do his work for him. A duke's brother-in-law on one side of the table and a music teacher on the other, and the world arranged accordingly. He sat beside his solicitor with the settled expression of a man who has run this arithmetic many times and found the same comfortable answer. Lady Harwick was in the gallery, upright, gray-gloved, still as a standard. The room smelled of wet wool and tallow, and the particular tension of a crowd that has come expecting something. Half the county, it seemed, had found business in Kettermore on the 14th. Philippa sat at the opposite table. Beside her was Mr. Marsh, her publisher, who had spent the past week acquiring opinions he hoped never to need. Beside Mr. Marsh sat a musicologist from the Royal Philharmonic Society who had traveled from London on the 13th at the request of a correspondent whose name had not been mentioned to anyone. Rollo Harwick's solicitor presented the case, the annotations, which had been reproduced with considerable skill, the manuscript, dates, the portfolio, and the claim of authorship extending back, the solicitor said with great confidence, to January of 1811. The magistrate looked at the score. He looked at the dedication. He looked at Rollo Harwick. "Can you play these works?" he said. A pause. "I am not a performing musician," Rollo said. The magistrate looked at Philippa. "Can you?" She went to the pianoforte, an elderly upright that smelled of rosin and the accumulated years of other people's practice, and she sat, and she played the nocturne in D without music, from memory, and she played it all the way through, including the variation in the development section, the variation that was not written in any score. The variation she had improvised one afternoon when a grieving child had asked if the sad part could be made a little less sad, and which she had never written down because it belonged to that afternoon and to that room and to that particular child's particular sadness, and she had held it in her memory the way one holds something that cannot be replaced. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The musicologist presented a comparison of handwriting samples, the dedication on the score against the letter Philippa had written to Mr. Marsh in 1812. He indicated 7 points of correspondence in the letter forms. He noted, specifically, the lowercase e, the inward hook of it, the particular pressure of the pen at the top of the curve. He recommended the magistrate examine both documents through a glass. The door at the back of the room opened. He walked the full length of the room slowly, without looking left or right, with the absolute unhurried calm of someone who has been in rooms where everything depended on how he entered them, and has learned that stillness carries more weight than any amount of announcement. He reached the magistrate's table, and he placed upon it a single sheet of paper. It was a letter from Rollo Harwick to a printer in York, dated the spring of 1814, requesting the production of facsimile reproductions from a set of original manuscript pages. The printer had kept it in his records for 2 years while his invoice went unpaid, because printers are methodical people and invoices are evidence. He stepped back. He looked at Rollo Harwick across the width of the room. "You had her annotations copied," he said, not loudly. The room was already silent. "You commissioned reproductions before returning the originals to the folio, so that when the folio disappeared, you would have documents in your possession that appeared original. The printer kept the invoice because you never paid him." He paused for exactly one beat. You should have paid him. Lady Harwick made no sound in the gallery. She was, Philippa thought later, the kind of woman who makes no sound even when the floor drops beneath her, because making a sound would require acknowledging that something had gone wrong, and acknowledging it would make it true. He turned from Rollo Harwick then. He turned to Philippa, and everything about him changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was quieter than that, like a house when the wind drops, and you suddenly hear all the small sounds that were always there. His face, which had been still and careful, became simply his face. The gray eyes that had been level and precise became something warmer and more private, something that was only for her and had been only for her. She understood now for weeks. "The score is yours," he said, and his voice was lower, "and only for her. All of it. It always was. And I am very sorry it took this long." She held his gaze. She thought, "I called him ordinary." She thought, "I was wrong about almost everything. I was right about the Bernie." "You were too slow in the library," she said. "About the Bernie." His almost smile appeared again, the one that had been somewhere dark and was still finding its way. "I was," he said. "I intend to be considerably faster from this point forward." The following April, the Andante Favori Society held a concert in York. At the center of the second half, the program listed a nocturne in D and variations, composed by Miss Philippa Helena Crane. On the inside cover, printed in full, was the original dedication to Miss Eleanor Tavish, Kettermore, January 1811. May the sad parts always find their way, eventually, to something lighter. Philippa sat in the front row. She was no longer Miss Crane. She had been the Duchess of Norbourne for 3 months, a fact she found, turns by turns, absurd, grounding, and on certain mornings, pale early light, the sound of him breathing beside her, the particular stillness of a room that has become, without her quite noticing, a home quietly extraordinary. He sat next to her. He had bought a new coat because she had told him he was permitted to, and he had gone out the following morning and done it with the thoroughness of a man who does not make concessions halfway. She had fully confirmed by now, no musical judgment of any kind. He could not reliably distinguish a waltz from a minuet, but he listened to her play with a quality of attention she had never received from anyone, the complete and absolute attention of a man who is not listening to the music but to her. She found she preferred it enormously to being understood by connoisseurs. The nocturne began. She had heard it many times. She had never heard it like this in a warm hall full of people who knew her name, with Eleanor Tavish, now 14, and serious and extraordinarily talented, sitting 3 rows back with tears running quietly down her face that she was clearly pretending were not there. Philippa felt his hand come to rest over hers in the dark, still and unhurried, the way he did most things. She thought of Lady Harwick's voice in that cold morning room. "You composed nothing." She thought the sad part got a little less sad, and it turned out to be the best part of the whole piece. And it is mine, and it always was, and the person beside me has known it longer than anyone. She turned her hand over, under his, and held on. And that, she thought, the warm hall, the music she had written in grief and given to a grieving child, the man who had read her truly before he ever saw her face, the sound of something that was hers being played aloud for the world to hear, that was not a small life, that was not ordinary at all. If the moment that stayed with you was Philippa, turning back to her pupil in that frost-white glasshouse and saying quietly, "Let's try it again from the second bar." Then you already understand what this story is really about. Not the villain's exposure, not the hearing, not even the love, though the love is everything. It is about the decision made in a moment of genuine devastation to keep going, to continue the lesson, to believe the work is worth finishing even when the world has just told you it was never yours. If that moved you, subscribe. This channel is for stories about people who keep going when they have every reason to stop. And here is the question I want you to sit with. Have you ever had someone convince you to doubt the evidence of your own experience, your own memory, your own work, your own sense of what happened? And what was it, in the end, that made you certain again? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know.